The most dangerous myth about serial killers is that they snap. We picture a person who loses control in a single, terrible moment. The truth is almost the opposite. The serial offender is defined not by losing control, but by a cold, patient kind of control that builds over years. To understand them, you have to stop imagining an explosion and start imagining a rehearsal. This is what the research and the case literature reveal about what is actually happening inside that mind. Investigators and psychologists who study these offenders describe a process, not an event. The behavior emerges gradually, often over a decade or more, through distinct psychological stages. There is rarely a single cause and never a single instant of transformation. By the time a serial killer acts, the act has usually been imagined, refined, and rehearsed in private for a very long time. The crime is the final stage of something that started quietly, years before. Many, it begins in adolescence with fantasy. That in itself is not unusual. Almost everyone has a vivid inner life as a teenager. What sets the future offender apart is the content and the function of those fantasies. Where most daydreams are about belonging, success, or escape, theirs increasingly circle around power and control over another person. At first, it is just imagination. But it is imagination that is being practiced. Researchers consistently find that the fantasy serves a purpose. It is an escape. Often, the future offender feels powerless, humiliated, or invisible in their real life. Inside the fantasy, they are completely in control. But the more painful or empty reality feels, the more time is spent in that inner world, and the more elaborate and important it becomes. The fantasy is not a symptom on the side. For some, it slowly becomes the center of their life. Over time in the offenders who go on to kill, the fantasy shifts. It stops being only an escape and becomes specifically about domination. About holding total power over another human being. The details grow more concrete and more rehearsed. This is the crucial turn that most people who escape into fantasy never make. The line is not crossed in the world yet, but in the mind, it has already been crossed many times. By their own later accounts, many offenders rehearsed the act mentally for years. They refined it, corrected it, perfected it in imagination. This is why investigators so often find a first crime that is already disturbingly practiced. It was practiced, just not in reality. The long rehearsal also explains the patience. The offender is not in a hurry because in their mind they have already done it 100 times. Eventually, for reasons that are often mundane, a stressor, an opportunity, a loss, the fantasy is acted out for the first time. Studies of offenders describe this first crime as a kind of test, an attempt to make reality match the imagined version. It is rarely the clean, controlled event of the fantasy, and that gap between what was imagined and what actually happened turns out to matter enormously for what comes next. The disappointment becomes the engine of repetition. After the act comes a period that experts call the cooling off. It is the emotional gap between crimes, and it is the single feature that distinguishes a serial offender from a spree or a one-time killer. During this period, the offender may feel relief, then a slow return of the old emptiness, then the fantasy beginning again. The length of this cycle varies enormously, from days to years. But the pattern of pause and return is the signature rhythm of the type. The cycle tends to repeat with a grim regularity. A build-up of tension and fantasy, the act, a short-lived relief, and then the slow return of the need. Psychologists have compared the structure to an addiction, and the comparison is useful. Like an addiction, it offers a temporary high followed by a deeper low, and like an addiction, it tends to demand more over time to achieve the same effect. Because the relief fades and the fantasy keeps growing, the behavior usually escalates. Offenders take more risks, act more often, or seek more control, chasing a satisfaction that keeps slipping away. This escalation is dangerous for victims, but it is also, ultimately, dangerous for the offender. The same growing boldness that feeds the need is what eventually leads to the mistakes that get them caught. The escalation is both the engine and the fault line. Investigators separate two things in a series of crimes. The first is the modus operandi, or method, the practical way the offender operates. The method is learned behavior, and it changes. As the offender gains experience, they refine how they select, approach, and control a victim, and how they avoid detection. Because it is practical, the method evolves. On its own, a changing method can actually hide the fact that the crimes are connected at all. The second thing is the signature, and it is far more revealing. The signature is the personal, often unnecessary element an offender repeats to satisfy a psychological need, not a practical one. Unlike the method, the signature stays remarkably consistent, because it comes from the fantasy itself. It is the part of the crime that is for them. Investigators prize it, because while the method is craft, the signature is identity, and identity is much harder to disguise. Many offenders take something away. A personal item, a photograph, a small object. These trophies let them relive the act during the long cooling-off period, feeding the fantasy until the cycle begins again. The trophy is a psychological tool, a way to extend the high. It is also, for investigators, a profound vulnerability. The need to keep a piece of the crime means the offender is often holding, somewhere, the very evidence that can convict them. Strip away the variations, and researchers keep returning to one core: control. For many serial offenders, the act is fundamentally about exercising total power over another person, a power they feel they lack everywhere else. The violence is the means, domination is the end. This is why understanding the type is less about a taste for violence, and more about a desperate, bottomless need to feel in control. Everything else, the fantasy, the trophies, the signature, serves that need. To act repeatedly, an offender has to perform a psychological trick. Turning a person into an object, researchers describe a process of dehumanization, in which victims are stripped, in the offender's mind, of their full humanity. This is not a detail. It is what makes the rest possible. The same absence of empathy that profilers measure is what allows the offender to see a human being as a thing to be used. It is, perhaps, the coldest part of the whole picture. Put together, the stages form a working model that profilers use. A fantasy that begins as escape, turns toward control, and is rehearsed for years. A first act that disappoints, and then a repeating cycle of escalation and cooling off. It is a model, not a law. Real people are messier than any diagram. To make sense of crime scenes, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit popularized a split between organized and disorganized offenders. The organized type plans carefully, controls the scene, and leaves little behind. The disorganized type is impulsive and chaotic, leaving a scene that looks frenzied. The model has real limits. Many offenders are a mix, and behavior changes over time. But as a first lens for reading a scene, the distinction has shaped profiling for decades. Between crimes, most serial offenders are unremarkable. They hold jobs, have families, attend church, mow the lawn. This ordinariness is not an act they struggle to maintain. For many, it is simply the other half of a compartmentalized life. The neighbor who later expresses disbelief is not naive. They are describing the mask accurately. The horror of the type is precisely that the monster and the ordinary man are the same person, and the seam between them is almost invisible. Psychologists describe a striking ability to compartmentalize, to keep the two lives sealed off from each other. The offender can be a loving parent in one compartment and commit terrible acts in another, with little apparent conflict. This is not the same as a split personality. It is a deliberate, functional separation. It is also why those closest to them so often see nothing. They are only ever shown one of the two compartments, and it is the ordinary one. Although the fantasy is always present, a specific crime is often set off by a stressor in the offender's real life. A job loss, a rejection, a humiliation, a relationship ending. The stressor does not create the killer. The structure was already there, but it can act as a trigger, tipping a long-running fantasy into action. Investigators sometimes find that a series of crimes maps onto a series of upheavals in the offender's outwardly ordinary life. Over a long series, offenders frequently report that the fantasy stops delivering. The same act no longer satisfies. The relief is shorter. The emptiness returns faster. This decay is what pushes the escalation. More risk, more frequency, more extremity. A search for a feeling that grows harder to reach. It is a trap of the offender's own making. The very thing they built to feel powerful slowly stops working and demands ever more to function at all. People often ask why a serial offender does not simply stop. The model suggests an answer. The behavior is wired to a core need for control, fed by a fantasy that decays and demands more, and reinforced by the relief each act briefly brings. It functions like a compulsion. Some do pause for long stretches, and a few effectively stop. But for most, the loop is self-sustaining, and only an external force, arrest or death, finally breaks it. As the need grows and the caution that marked the early crimes erodes, offenders take chances they once would not have. They act closer to home, keep more trophies, communicate more, plan less. Profilers watch for exactly this drift because it is predictable. The escalation that feeds the offender is the same escalation that exposes them. In case after case, the end begins when the need finally outruns the caution that kept them safe. A subset of offenders need more than the act. They need an audience. They write to police, name themselves, taunt investigators, or insert themselves into the case. Psychologically, this is the fantasy demanding recognition. The power feels incomplete if no one knows. It is also, almost always, a fatal mistake. Every contact is evidence, and the same ego that craves attention is what eventually hands investigators the thread that unravels everything. It would be more comfortable to conclude that these offenders are simply inhuman, a different species. The research does not allow it. They have ordinary lives, ordinary masks, recognizable needs, taken to a monstrous extreme. The discomfort of studying them is exactly this. They are human beings who built, over years, a private machinery for harm and then chose to run it. Understanding that machinery is not excusing it, it is the only way to recognize it sooner. A long series ends in one of a few ways. Most often, the escalation produces a mistake, and an investigator who has been patient finally has something to pull. Sometimes the offender's own need for an audience exposes them. Occasionally they simply stop or die, and the case goes cold for decades until modern forensics reopens it. What almost never happens is the clean escape the offender imagined. The same fantasy that drove them is, in the end, what gives them away. If this breakdown was worth your time, consider subscribing. Each episode looks calmly at the mind behind the crime, what the evidence actually shows, and where the myths get it wrong. The lesson of the serial offender is an unsettling one. They are not made in a moment of madness, but built slowly, in private, out of fantasy and need and choice. And because they are built, the warning signs are there to be seen. If we are willing to look. Thanks for watching.